Wow, guys, another tier list. So Konami's finally murdered Tearlaments, so it's definitely changed up how things are. Now, what's interesting about this ban list, I'd say, is that a lot of rogue decks, like I talked about before, have gotten support. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how a lot of them fit into the meta now. So to start off with, if we talk about pendulums, so Beyond the Pendulum is representative of, I'd say, all of whatever the best pendulum deck is. Now, I would say this is actually firmly in rogue like before, but what's interesting is that because Endymion just got Servant back to 3, that's definitely a big buff for that archetype and like Zephyr Endymion builds and stuff. And it will be interesting to see if this deck does well. And I do think it has a place in the meta. Mainly because right now, targeting is quite big. Most decks are targeting to out your cards. Endymion has access to an untargetable boss monster, an untargetable, undestroyable boss monster, which isn't something that's common. And then it's also got kind of good destruction effects and stuff like that as well. Now, it's a pendulum deck, so it has those weaknesses, but it'll be interesting to see if someone can top a rogue or something with an Endymion build just because of that. Because, I mean, even into Kashtira, for example, they play 3-ofs of everything. They don't really care if they get banished. It does annoy you a bit in terms of your recursion, but you don't instantly lose by getting your cards banished. You can out the Kashtira board quite simply because pendulums can play cards like Lava Golem and Sphere Mode. So yeah, definitely firmly in rogue, but it'll be interesting to see what happens. Skystrike I still think is crap. I'm actually going to put it all the way down in non-meta, just because it's a deck that loses hard to Kashtira, along with Mystic Mind, Burn and Stall. I like Mystic Mind obviously is gone, but just generic burn and stall strategies, I just don't think they really work anymore. Now, Sprite is definitely a tier 1 deck at the moment. The version we're seeing probably most commonly, or I think the one that will be the best, is Runic Sprite. Runic Sprite hasn't really been touched. I mean, the loss of Sprite Elf is a little bit frustrating for it, but it doesn't, I would say, stun the deck completely. It can still play. And the Runic cards are really good this format. Runic cards are quite good against Kashtira, just because none of the Kashtira monsters really can protect themselves. So they can out things like a Rice Heart and stuff very, very easily, just having that amount of utility, which is great. Dragon Link is going to start off at the bottom of tier 2 high rogue, and then like I say, every format it just climbs up slowly. Now what's nice about Dragon Link is obviously it's one of the decks that can actually play the Bestials as combo pieces, the other one being branded, and so that kind of gives it a nice advantage. But this format, I would say the power level of decks in general is quite high still, just because Sprite is still a very strong deck, Kashtira is still a very strong deck, Branded is still a very strong deck. So while this is the bottom of tier 2, it'll be interesting to see what happens moving forward. Runic, I'm going to put at high tier 2 or low tier 1, and it's in my one to watch, but it's high tier 2, low tier 1, and this is like Runic Stun as opposed to Runic Sprite. One of the things I think about Runic that is just so amazing, and we saw it in YCS Leon, even though that wasn't new format, but one of the things about Runic is its ability to counter the meta is just so great. And now that the Ishizu cards are gone, like Runic was one of the best decks moving into moving into whatever format it was before with the Ishizu cards, Magnificent Maven format. However, the Ishizu cards really hard hurt them. Losing Mystic Mind, they didn't actually care that much about. The deck can kind of stun you with Messenger and Peace and other cards instead, but the Ishizu Shufflers were the real thing that killed it. Well, now most of the Ishizu Shufflers are gone again. Kashtira is a bit annoying, but they do have, I would say, a relatively favoured matchup against them, and then they can just play stuff like Majesty Swing and lock you out of the game. So definitely a deck to watch out for. I think it's got a lot of potential. Now, Sun Avalon, I'm going to leave in mid to low rogue, but there is a Sun Avalon Generate build floating around that I actually think is very good and might have the chance to be low tier 2, just because it's a 1-card combo, the Sun Avalon cards, that only requires 6 cards, where there's 6 cards, one of which is a brick, or 7 cards, one of which is a brick, and 4 extra deck spots. And then obviously the Generated cards are just good cards in general. Boss Stage is a great boss monster, and Generator's got some pretty good support in Photon Hypernova, which gives them potential. So the Generator Sun Avalon build, I think, has a bit of potential. Probably still mid to low rogue, but yeah. Sword Soul, mid tier 2. Yeah, it's a good deck. We've basically, again, all of the power of the element cards have been nerfed, basically. So the decks before that, the Branded and the Sword Souls, are still good. Sword Soul's nice as that mid-range deck that can just kind of do it all. And so yeah, definitely mid-tier 2. It's not got a terrible Kashtira matchup. Doesn't mind about its cards being banished. Doesn't lose to having its extra deck sniped because it plays most of the important cards as 2-ofs. Good deck in general. Virtual World, unfortunately, yeah, low, mid-rogue. It just isn't consistent enough. Labyrinth is another tier 1 deck. Labyrinth just got really good support with Big Welcome Labyrinth. It's focused on back row, which means it doesn't lose to the Kashtira locks of locking the monster zones, and it can out the board really easily with using like generic traps. Can set D barrier from deck. I mean, the ability to set generic traps from deck is absolutely insane, because it basically means that Labyrinth a lot of the times will free win against decks like Sword Soul and Despia, which is just absolutely crazy. So yeah, very, very good deck. And being a back row deck, being the only back row deck is always the position you want to be. When there's only like one good back row deck. So like if Runic, for example, becomes super popular alongside Labyrinth, that's a problem because now everyone's siding back row removal. But right now, when I would say there's not a lot of back row decks in the format, that's where you want to be because some people aren't even siding things like Lightning Storm because it's like there's not enough back row decks in the format. And so you can just sweep people by having too much back row for them to deal with. Madolche, yeah, rogue, high rogue, low tier 2. It's an okay deck. We're moving into a more of a hand trap format again, which is good and bad for Madolche because Madolche is a deck that, while it doesn't like hand traps, I would hazard a way of saying that it can kind of play around them to an extent, but I'd still say it's kind of mid to low rogue. Losing the Ishizu cards is a little bit of a pain for Madolche as well because they actually did help the deck out a bit in terms of keeping the graveyard empty. But yeah, mid to low rogue. Drytron, I'm going to say, is no longer non-meta. It's still rogue. It's no longer non-meta. Now, Kashtira is a horrible matchup for it. Bystials do still exist, and the Ishizu Shufflers are still there, even though they're at 1. So Drytron is definitely weak, but they do have some lovely help from the Mekanko cards, and Choju of the Trillion Hands as well as another cards that they're playing, which basically makes Herald of Perfection free, because you summon Choju, and now you've got a level 6 on board to summon the Herald with as well, which is just great. But in spite of that, I'm not sure if Drytron will be able to rise above all of the kind of graveyard hate that is still in the format. We're still in a relatively graveyard hating format. Dinos, look, people keep telling me Dinos is good. I'm almost convinced to dump it in non-meta because I'm not convinced. I just don't think it beats Kashtira. Yes, you've got Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, but you're never getting there. You've got so many generic one-offs or two-offs that you just, if they get banished, it's peak. Yes, you can Tyranno their board, but you activate so many effects before that I'll be shocked if you consistently are getting to Tyranno. If they lock up your monster zones, it hurts. Whatever. Anyway, Dinos is one to watch, but I don't really think that. It's just because other people are saying it, so we'll see what happens. Grand Margin on meta, unfortunately, is just not the banished deck anymore, unfortunately. Like, it can sneak wins, but not because it's great. Tri-Brigade, I'm actually going to leave at kind of mid to low rogue. At first, I had Tri-Brigade as potential tier 2. But after seeing it in action, I think the deck's trash. I think it's just really, really bad. The only thing it has for it is that it can play a lot of hand traps. But beyond that, I don't think it's doing anything particularly special with its format. I think Appaloosa Revolt is a terrible board. Like, it used to be a great board, but now it's just a terrible board to end on. Shure used to be really, really unique and awesome as removal, but decks like Kashtira don't even really care a lot of the times. And again, you're not getting to it if you're going second. If you're going first, it's an okay board sometimes, but it's like you're not even getting to your boss monsters half the time. Flunder, I'm actually going to put in mid tier 2, and this is why. Before Barrier Statue ban, so they lost Barrier Statue, which definitely hurts them, is why they're not solid tier 1. But before, and I played Flunder in a regional, and I have a mate of mine who actually almost topped YCS Leader. He bubbled on the YCS Leon, unfortunately. But he was playing Flunder, and he does go second build of Flunder, so he plays things like evenly, like Lightning Storm and such. And one of the things I found when playing it is that Barrier Statue wasn't as necessary as you think it is. You can play Flunder quite effectively without Barrier Statue. And because of that, I think going for a blind second, just crack your opponent's board and then put a bunch of Flunders on the board. Snowl is very, very good this format because booking boards is good this format. Yeah, I think Flunder has a lot of potential, and like it's not as oppressive as it was before, but I think that just opens more avenues to play the Flunder matchup. The other thing as well is they do have Scary Sea. They have the other trap to play with, which is great. Eldritch is bad because unfortunately Lights and Darks and Graveyard-reliant trap deck, so just not that good. Dragon Link build, so as opposed to kind of the pure rocket ones, this is more of the punk Dragon Brave kind of nonsense. I don't think that build is amazing. It's still rogue. It's better than for its rogue because obviously like Tearlaments going and stuff does buff a lot of these decks, and no Barrier Statue buffs these decks, but it's still like it's not amazing. Sisters is bad. I'm sorry, it's just a bad deck. It's somewhere mid rogue, and the only deck it was really good at checking, which it didn't even check half the time, was Tearlaments. But Tearlaments isn't really relevant anymore. Like, it's still a good deck, but it's not relevant enough to warrant playing Sisters in the tournament, so yeah, don't play that. Salamangreat and all of the Cyber decks I actually think are definitely ones to watch, so I'm going to put the one that is best. I still think Salad is the best out of all of them. I know some people disagree and think Marincess and such, but I still think Salad is the best. But all the Cyber decks are definitely ones to watch out for, and I'll go through them differently. So Salamangreat and Marincess are basically the same deck in that they're more slow control based Cyber decks, but they're not light or dark, and that's their main advantage, which means they don't lose to they don't lose to Bystials. And then in addition to that, they have unique utility. So Salamangreat has its traps, which is just really, really good. It means that it can kind of play the game without them, which is nice. Now, they are Graveyard-reliant, which isn't good against Kashtira, but they play hand traps, and Kashtira loses to hand traps. Not only that, but while Sprite doesn't lose to hand traps, they are no longer as resilient as before. They don't have as much. Sprite Elf's real thing is giving it a lot of recursion and some more interactivity. They don't have that as much. And so the hand traps that Salamangreat will be playing, or that Marincis or Mathmech will be playing, is going to be very good. And so that's what I think helps that deck be good and gives it potential for next format. Now, Mathmech is different. The reason why I think Mathmech is good now is because even though it's a light and dark deck, I think the real strength of Mathmech is its ability to go second. I think blind second Mathmech is probably where you want to be, just because it does not care about losing. So when you play a deck going second this format, the biggest worry for you most of the time is going to be the Kashtira board. Kashtira banishing your key one-offs in your main deck, your extra deck. Mathmech doesn't really have any key one-offs that it cares about losing. It just wants to put a bunch of Cyburst bodies on the board and OTK, and I do think it can do that through a Kashtira board, even if the Kashtira board is macrocosmosing them. And they can play a lot of crazy board breakers and such, which is great. So yeah, definitely I think that's potential. Punk, somewhere mid to low rogue. Yeah, it's just not that good, I think. I think the problem with Punk is it's just really a generic combo deck. It's not doing anything particularly unfair, unfortunately. DDD, we had Jacked recently on the Yu-Gi-Oh show, so make sure you go and watch that. So yeah, DDD, I don't think it's amazingly good, but somewhere mid rogue. It can play a lot of hand traps, which is nice, but it's still the same as before. The power level of the game is still too high. Tearlaments, I'm going to say, is probably mid-tier 2. Mid-tier 2 might creep into tier 1 later. It's become a deck similar to Dragon Link, where it's like it needs to be solved. So it lost, and I think it's a testament to how powerful Tearlaments was, that it lost, like, all of its cards, and it's still this strong. Like, I'd still say, for example, a Tearlament deck will handedly beat pretty much every deck on this list, barring maybe Kashtira. Like, it will probably beat every single deck here in a 1v1 most of the time, because it is still that strong. But it does have some weaknesses now. It has got a few choke points. It's harder for it to just get going instantly. But then we're seeing Tearlaments players playing things like Diviner and Makango and stuff to make Beatrice and Send. And there's just a lot of different ways to play this deck. So I think the real thing about Tearlaments is that we just have to wait and see what happens. It's going to be a few months maybe, and then people will solve Tearlaments and then bring it back into the format. I don't know if it will ever be tier 1 again, but it will be a meta deck for a while. I definitely think so, because I'll be shocked if Konami hits it again. Even if it became a really good deck this format, I don't think Konami's going to slap it up again. It just doesn't make sense. Ignister, I'm actually going to say, is also a higher tier rogue deck than the rest of the Cyburst decks. Oh, I'd say it's on the same level as Gazelle, just because, again, it can play a lot of hand traps. Obviously, it doesn't like Kashtira, but other than Kashtira, it's actually good against every other deck in the format. Kashtira is the only deck that Ignister really doesn't like. Every other deck it's got a good matchup against, I would say, especially because Arrival is just difficult to out. And one of the things that it's changed from before is that before last format we were seeing a lot of just beat over it or just make Ninja Shadow Mosquito and stuff like that. But because hand traps are back in the format, the whole play of kind of putting Arrival on the board and then holding a nib in your hand, or putting Arrival on the board and backing it up with hand traps or floodgates, is actually a valid strategy again. So I do think Ignister has potential. Again, this is a whole bunch of decks in Rogue, so it's not like it's going to be tearing up tournaments and stuff, but it does have potential. I don't think it's one to look at. ABC Scrap. Altergeist is, yeah, it's just a bad trap deck. I don't think there's much to say about it. Branded is definitely a tier 1 deck as well. Now, I'll say what's interesting, and I almost want to make tier 1, 2, and 2.5 or something, because I would say that there is a clear division between, I would almost say, yeah, Branded is high tier 2, low tier 1, and I'd say these 3 and these 2 are ahead of the other decks here. But there's a big difference between Sprite and Labyrinth, and then Branded, Flunder, and Sword Soul. I think Branded, Flunder, and Sword Soul are clearly weaker than those, but they are clearly stronger than everything else. Now, Branded, here's my problem with Branded. I'm actually going to do a more in-depth video about Branded. The new support for Branded is really good, but my problem with the new support is that, fundamentally speaking, in most game states, it doesn't change anything this format. Adding an extra Grand Guganol and Rindrum, Gunhammer, whatever that one is called, on the board, doesn't... It's not that deep. It's not that amazing of interrupt. Guganol is not that good because all it can really do is summon Prosecinian, which isn't good this format because there's not that many relevant Link, Fusion, Synchros, blah, 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 just floating in the grave for you to play into, and Quaritus is not relevant unless you're losing already. Then Rinbrum or Linhammer negate, it's the same problem. It's a very myopic negate that it only affects fusion, synchros, links, and XYZs, and it doesn't even destroy them. Its graveyard effect is good, but the fact that your opponent can do something like summon Fenrir, beat over it, make smashes, get rid of it, stuff like that, to me makes that board not worth it, especially as, fundamentally speaking, if you activate Branded Fusion, you should win. And that board doesn't change anything. I was probably winning if I resolved Branded Fusion anyway. This is just a slightly better version of the Branded Fusion end board, and that's my problem with it. But I do still think Branded is better than before. I think Cartesia is a real queen for Branded, and I think that's the only good thing about Grand Guganol. That's why, for me, I was actually playing one in my extra deck, because Cartesia makes the Despia and Branded and Albaz side of the deck. So Despia and Albaz side of the deck a lot less bricky, because now I have an easy access to a fusion all the time. I have an easy way to get into my Despia fusions and get those Branded or Albaz cards out of my hand. Now I can play 3 Albaz and get to my Mirror Jade without having to see Branded Fusion, and I can do that semi-consistently. It's a bit of a neggy combo, which makes me want to play Patchwork again, but it's possible. And I think that is so important for changing the dynamic of Branded. I think that's why Branded is so strong right now, where it's like they've got a new starter that's actually quite good to play. That's not just a Luba. So yeah, Branded, that's a long-winded way of saying Branded is tier 2. I don't think the new cards are that amazing other than Cartesia, but yeah, it will be definitely interesting to see what happens. Verniself, unfortunately, is going to be mid to low rogue. Yeah, not much to say about that. Naturia Runic is definitely a tier 2 deck, and I'd probably put it, again, for now, it's above these kind of unsolved decks, but I'd say Naturia Runic is good. Losing the Ishizu cards hurts, but Runic cards are still very, very good, and it doesn't like being banished, but having access to the Runic cards in your deck means that you have utility to play around the Kashtira board, which is quite good. So yeah, Runic definitely one to look at. Dogmatica, look, I said this before and I say it again, I definitely think it's one to watch. So it's it's somewhere mid-rogue, mid-high rogue, but I definitely think the Dogmatica cards are one to watch. Yeah, Zoa is a crazy card. Being able to nuke 6 or 7 cards out of your opponent's extra deck or hand on turn 1 is absolutely insane. Like, yeah, being able to do that off 1 card as well is really, really insane. So it's definitely a card that has a lot of potential. The problem is we're just not in the correct format for it. It does kind of insta-lose. Dogmatica, all of the Dogmatica cards unfortunately insta-lose to Kashtira because you can't even activate Nadir server, for example, which is a bit of a shame. But yeah, definitely Dogmatica is one to watch. Now, the Ishizu cards are non-meta now. I would say they're non-meta or low rogue. You would play, if you were playing them before in your deck, so for example, a deck like Naturia Runic or a deck like Tearlaments, probably you could still play all of the one-offs, but you just can't build a deck around it, and you don't really have to play around it anymore because the opponent's not reliably drawing them. So that's the biggest problem. So the Ishizu cards, I would say, are non-meta. As an engine, they're like okay for very certain decks, but nothing special. Kashtira, tier 1. The problem with Kashtira, fundamentally speaking, is this. It's just a really obnoxious deck. It's a really obnoxious deck that will just win for free just because the cards are just better. It's hard to play around someone face down banishing your main deck and extra deck. That's just hard to play around. It's hard to play around Arise Heart just getting materials for free. It's hard to play around your zones. Well, actually, no, you actually can play around your zones being locked, but you have to do weird things like play like lava golems and stuff, so it doesn't matter if they lock your zones. So Kashtira just does so many unfair things. And then also, they summon lots of big bodies for free. All of their bodies are huge and summon for free into an empty board, and they have tons and tons of extenders, and all of that together just adds up to this really obnoxiously powerful deck. Kashtira is very easy to counter. You can out their board. You see them, they lose their whole board. You can hand trap them. You can Ash and Imperm and stuff, and they can't make a good board and all these kind of things. But fundamentally speaking, it will win games against most decks just because it's unfair. Like if Kashtira wins the Dash Roll goals first, a lot of times it's just going to win because it's just going to, you're not even going to get to play. And I think that's the unfair nature of Kashtira that makes it hard to deal with. I also think it's actually quite good blind second as well. I think blind second Kashtira might even be the move just because Sphere Mode and Lava Golem are just so good, and Kashtira really doesn't need its normal summon. Like I've been smashing on DB, not using the normal summon, just you out their board and then you just beat them with a bunch of big monsters. It's really, really effective. So yeah, definitely the best deck. We'll see how the format evolves. It probably won't stay the best deck because it's so easy to counter. If people start hating on it, it will lose hard. But it's definitely the best deck. Rescue Ace is not meta, it's bad. Purely needs more support, even though it has potential. Mekanko is going to be mixed with another deck. So this is another one to watch because it needs to be mixed with another deck for its potential. But it has potential. There's a lot of different cool things you can do in Mekanko. As a pure deck, it's not amazing, I would say. I'd say its strategy is a bit interesting. even though Lava Golem is a really good card right now, Lava Golem someone's board and trying to OTK it just isn't enough. And this card actually, to do that, you need specific 2 and 3 card combos to get all of the monsters on board. When they get their next 2 cards, they get a monster and another spell card, if I'm not mistaken. They might be another equip, I think. I think it becomes a lot easier to do that kind of OTK, but before that, I'd say Mechanical's, yeah, mid or somewhere in Rogue. Plunder Patrol, I'll probably say low tier 2, high Rogue. Probably the best Rogue deck. Yeah, one of the things about Plunder Patrol that's just nice is that it's got a good Kashtira matchup, in my opinion, just because of the ability to put a token on the board. Like, it's got an inbuilt win condition against Kashtira, and like, you put the token on the board, and now they have to do a bunch of gymnastics to deal with it, and you can like add rivalry to that for even more shenanigans. It can play loads of hand traps, which is good. It can play loads of board breakers, which is good. It's not super reliant on normal summon. It can play the Brave Engine, which is good right now. It plays really well with Triple Tactics Thrust because of cards like the Brave Engine. I mean, yeah, it's just a really, really good deck at the moment. Now, it's still got some of the critical weaknesses of before, which is that it can be a bit resource intensive because you do need to constantly discard. It will play into thrust and talents and such, which is bad. And it actually does struggle to out big monsters as well. Even though the monsters can get big, it needs a lot of set for them to get big. But it's definitely a good deck. Definitely probably the best rogue deck. Crystal Beast as well is another good control rogue deck. I think the weakness of Crystal Beast... So we're seeing a lot of Crystal Beasts. Well, not a lot, but we're seeing some people play Crystal Beast with Kashtira, which is interesting. But I think the only issue I have with it is that if I want to play some sort of stun stall strategy, which is what this is becoming, why aren't I playing Runic? That's the question. It's always... In formats, I always think that combo decks and stun decks, there tends to only ever be enough gas for room for like 1 or 2 max in the format. When you have more mid-range decks, you can have loads of them, but the best combo deck basically is Kashtira. If you want to FTK your opponent, it's probably Kashtira, so why aren't you playing that? If you want to stun your opponent, it's probably Runic, so why aren't you playing that? I can't see a reason why I'd play Crystal Beast over either of those decks, unfortunately. Now, moving into it, Tearlaments Kashtira I think has potential. So I'm going to put it as kind of another high tier 2 deck, just because we were seeing people obviously add the Tearlament cards into Kashtira, but I think now it's definitely a case of, yeah, mix the 2 archetypes together, use all of your extra starters that you get in Tearlaments. I do think it has potential. I don't think it's the best deck, but definitely one potential. Dark World, actually, I'm going to put, and this is a hot take, but I'm going to put it at the bottom of tier 2. I think with Tearlaments out of the format, Danger Dark World is in a really, really good position, because now people aren't siding as heavily for this graveyard stuff, and that was the problem before. You were just taking collateral L's by playing Dark World because everything that counted tiers counters you. Well, now not everything that counts tier isn't necessarily in the format, so you can actually play as Dark World. And then on top of that, what's really great is that the danger cards are actually really good this format. We like going second. Dark World can also play Lava Golem. We like that card. Like, there's a lot of great things about the deck. Now, there are some weaknesses. Obviously, it doesn't have an amazing Kashtira matchup because it doesn't like its cards being banished. It also will struggle against decks like Runic, because even though you do have some removal, it's all destructive, and Runic plays really well around destructive removal. But Dark World's still a really good deck. And yeah, I definitely think it's actually a low tier 2 deck right now. I think it has a lot of potential. And lastly, Gishki. Gishki is my last one to watch. Gishki, Sprite and stuff is probably low tier 2, low mid tier 2 one to watch. It was the best variant of Sprite until they got rid of Elf. I still think it's a very good variant of Sprite. I still think it's probably the way to go, but it's not as clear cut as before, so we just have to really see what people do. This is a deck that needs to be solved as well. I would say that we need to see what... It might need to be solved. It might just be that I'm ignorant of what Gishki can do, but it'll be interesting to see moving forward what people do with the Gishki deck. So guys, that is my tier list. I'm probably going to do another one in a month and see where the format settles, but thank you all for watching, and I'll talk to you all soon. Peace.